Hi, and welcome to the second lecture in our Learning to Love Isaiah series. I'm Kerry Muhlestein. I'm a professor of ancient scripture at BYU. I have degrees in Hebrew language and literature and Egyptology, and I teach courses on the Old Testament and Isaiah and other things about the ancient world and ancient scripture, and I love learning Isaiah, and I want to help you love to learn from Isaiah. It's just so much fun when we can really get some things out of Isaiah. So I'm happy to walk you through this and to give you some more tools to put in your toolbox for understanding Isaiah so that you can take great joy out of studying Isaiah. Let's remind ourselves just a little bit of why we want to study Isaiah and why it's so important. The Savior himself commanded it. He said, "Yea, a commandment I give unto you, that ye search these things diligently, for great are the words of Isaiah." Nephi encouraged us to delight in his words because I, Nephi, write more of the words of Isaiah, for my soul delighteth in his words. And we want to delight in them like Nephi does. He also thought that we should rejoice. He said, "Now I write some of the words of Isaiah, that whoso of my people shall see these words may lift up their hearts and rejoice for all men." The words of Isaiah should make us rejoice because we see salvation being taught. And so that's part of why we want to understand Isaiah. We need to remind ourselves it's going to take some effort. It's not going to be the easiest thing that we do, but it's going to be the thing that's worth it. So Nephi says, "I do speak somewhat concerning the words which I have written, which have been spoken by the mouth of Isaiah. For behold, Isaiah spake many things which were hard for many of my people to understand." He knows that it can be hard, but he also gave us the clues for understanding Isaiah. What are some of the answers for understanding Isaiah? As we talked about in Lecture 1, slowing down, being willing to pay a price, being willing to look at and take the time to study, pull out meaning, and learn some things about Isaiah so we can learn things from Isaiah. Nephi himself gave us some of these clues. Some of them are that we need to learn concerning the manner of prophesying among the Jews. That's part of what we're going to focus on in this lecture, is the manner of prophesying among the Jews. He says it also in elsewhere. He said that if we are going to understand these things, we have to be taught after the manner of the things of the Jews. What are the manner of prophesying of the Jews, or the manner of the prophets, or the manner of the things of the Jews? Well, in Lecture 1, we talked about a number of them, and today we are going to focus on poetry. And one other thing, but poetry is the first thing that we're going to focus on. That's part of the manner of prophesying among the Jews. Nephi gave us some more clues when he said that it was hard for people to understand, but he could understand the things of Isaiah because he understood the judgments of God, which hath come to pass among the Jews unto my children. He hasn't taught those unto my children, according to all that which Isaiah hath spoken, and I do not write them. So he understands it's harder if you don't know the judgments of God which hath come to pass among the Jews. In other words, God's way of interacting with the house of Israel, and that includes not only understanding history, but the way he interacts with them is through the covenant. So we made this list in Lecture 1 of the things that will help us understand Isaiah, and today we're going to focus on these two, on the manner of prophesying, and on history. We'll focus on covenant elsewhere, but today we're talking about manner of prophesying in history, and we start out by looking at the manner of prophesying. That's where we go first. And we're going to say that one of the things that can make this difficult is because there are some language challenges. There are a couple of elements of this language that makes this difficult. One of those is that Isaiah wrote in Hebrew, and most of us don't speak Hebrew. And it's always hard to understand something that has gone through translation. You miss some of the poetry, some of the rhyming, some of the feelings. In Lecture 1, we talked about some things you can pick up when you hear kav the kav, solve the solve, right? You miss some of those things no matter how good the English translation is. So that presents a difficulty, but again, a good commentary can help you with that, all right? But we have another language that we struggle with because we typically read in the King James Version, in English at least. Now, I love the King James Version. It is my favorite translation. It preserves more than most translations the literal nature of what was in Hebrew. There's one I think that is even more literal called Young's Literal Translation, but it's so literal it's almost impossible to understand. But this preserves it. It also preserves the power and of the poetry as well as it can. It just has beautiful poetic language. I think that the King James Version is excellent, but you have to become accustomed to it. It is much different than the English that we speak today. And so you just are going to have to work your way through it. I think if you've grown up reading the scriptures in King James English, it's a blessing to you. You understand it better. You understand English better as a result. If you haven't grown up with that, it just takes time. The more you study it, the easier it will be. All right. But one of the things is that Isaiah wrote in a really high register of Hebrew. And the King James English is a really high register of English, all right? And by register, this is what I mean. You text in a different way than you write a college essay. Well, I wish that were always true. Some of my students actually write their essays as if they were texting. But you're supposed to write differently in text than you do in a college essay. Texting is your lowest register of the language, really, and it's even lower than slang in many ways. And say a college essay or a legal document are our higher registers. And we usually live, for the most part, in a middle register with some ability in a higher register and some ability in a lower register. Some people live in that lower register, but the higher register is difficult for us, and we just have to get accustomed to it. There's something about just turning it on in your brain. There's a switch you can turn on and say, it's a higher register. I need to recognize that, and then it will make more sense to you, all right? So if we're going to deal with this higher register of language and the poetic power, we just have to get used to it. I'm just going to give you an example of the higher register. This does not preserve poetic power, but of the higher register of language. And I hope that it will help you just see what I'm talking about. And we're going to do 2 examples of it. And you'll see you'll catch on to the second example easier than the first example because your brain is flipped on and you've said, that's what's going on here, all right? So I'm going to give you a nursery rhyme. And I want you to just kind of see how long it takes you to recognize what nursery rhyme this is when it's given in a scientific high register of language, all right? So you just read this. A female of the Homo sapiens species was a possessor of a small immature ruminant, and I'm just going to let you read on your own for a moment, and then I'm going to point out what this is. So hopefully you're reading and you're figuring out what this is, because it's Mary had a little lamb. Mary is the Homo sapiens, and the little lamb that she possesses is the small immature ruminant of the genus Ovis, all right? And its outermost covering, which would be its fleece, reflected all wavelengths of visible light. That means it's white, with a luminosity equal to that of mass of naturally occurring microscopically crystalline water. That's snow. And then we get here the part about wherever Mary went, that lamb was 100% probability sure to go, right? So you get that. Now I'm going to put a second one up, and I think you'll get this one even quicker because now your brain is clicked onto this, all right? So read that for a second, and it probably didn't take you very long to recognize a triumvirate of marine rodents would be 3 mice. It's 3 blind mice because they're devoid of ophthalmic acuity, right? And so this is 3 blind mice, and that's something that I would guess you caught on to because your brain clicked on. So we just want to do that as we look at the King James Version, we just want to kind of click into, Isaiah writes in a high register, King James translates in a high register, the King James translators. So let's turn on our high register brain and start not going through it quickly, but going through it slowly enough to understand that, okay? But what we're really going to spend our time on is looking at some Hebrew poetic devices. There are a number of them. Symbolism is one that we talked about in Lecture 1 at length, really. For quite a while we talked about this. Symbolism is an important Hebrew poetic device. Most of these devices are not unique to Hebrew, by the way, but we'll spend some time on the one that is not unique to Hebrew, but not something common in modern languages. So first of all, symbolism. Metonymy is something that they use. We use that in modern poetry as well. Metonymy is when you use an attribute for the whole, like you say suits for businessmen, all right? So here's an example of metonymy. And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder. Well, we get the idea. Key is a way you open a door. He's not really putting the key on his door. That's a poetic way of saying he's given him the ability to run the house of David, right? That's an example of metonymy. All right, we also have synecdoche. Synecdoche is when you get a part for the whole. Like when we say all hands on deck, we actually want their whole body, not just the hands, right? So let's look at synecdoche in Isaiah. Isaiah uses synecdoche all the time. So for example, he uses Zion, which is a mountain in Jerusalem, as a way of referring to Jerusalem. But he uses Jerusalem as a way of referring to all of Judah and sometimes all of Israel. He uses daughter of Zion as a way of referring to all the people who live in Jerusalem, which then means a way of referring to all the people of Judah. He uses Ephraim as a way of referring to all of the tribes in the northern kingdom. He uses Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom or the kingdom of Israel, to refer to all of that northern kingdom or the kingdom of Israel. He uses Rezin, who is a king, to refer to his country. He uses Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, to refer to all of Syria, and so on, right? These are just some examples. Isaiah does this all the time. He loves taking just a part and using that to refer to the whole. It's a device he uses, and you just have to kind of look for that and get used to it. So now we're going to do a quiz, all right? Is the phrase, his hand is stretched out still, is that synecdoche or metonymy? And this is a trick quiz, I have to tell you, because it's actually neither, all right? It's just a symbol. And this gives me the chance to give you an Isaiah Mythbuster. We're going to have at least a couple of Mythbusters, but I want to focus on this one because this one is really prevalent in the church. Somehow, and I think I know how, but somehow we got this teaching going around in the church, not officially from the church, but lots of members of the church have accepted this, that anytime Isaiah says that God's hand is stretched out still, it means it's stretched out in mercy. That's not correct. The symbol of a hand being stretched out in the ancient world is that it's in action. In fact, in Egyptian, they're a kind of a hieroglyph that doesn't have a phonetic or translation value. It just helps you know what kind of a verb ran before it. So, for example, with the word bear, you might have an animal after the word bear in English. That would let you know it's the animal bear. Or you might have an arm that lets you know it's an action, which means it's bearing something, right? So the hieroglyph that tells you that an action is happening is an arm being stretched out, all right? It's just a way of saying that you're doing something. So when God's hand is stretched out still, it means he is going to continue doing whatever he was doing before. And in Isaiah, most of the time that actually is used to say he's not done punishing you, he's got more punishment coming. There are, I can only think of once, but there may be more than once, but at least one time where it is his mercy is being extended to you further. But most of the time, well, all the time, it's a continuation of whatever action was before that. And most of the time it's a continuation of punishment. And so we should look for that and understand that correctly when we are reading Isaiah rather than go with this kind of myth that's gone around in the church. His hand being stretched out is a way of saying he's continuing action, and that's good symbolism, right? Because your arm goes out to do something. So that's symbolism. Now, we've looked at synecdoche. Let's look at personification. Personification is when you take something that is inanimate and you treat it as if it's a person or describe it as if it's a person. So here's an example in Isaiah. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. They obviously don't really do this, but wow, it creates a feeling. It creates an image for us, right? That's what happens with personification. We also have metaphor and simile, and I think people are familiar with this, where you compare something. Sometimes you say that the vineyard is the house of Judah. Sometimes you say, and that's a metaphor. Sometimes you say it is like the house of Judah. That's a simile. So the song of the vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5 is a good example of this, where he says, the men of Judah are my pleasant plant, and the house of Judah is my vineyard, and so on. That's a good example of metaphor and simile. There are lots of poetic devices that you are used to that you'll find in Isaiah. What we want to spend our time on is one that you will be less familiar with, and that's called parallelism, all right? Parallelism is a poetic device that is common in Semitic cultures. It's all over the place in Hebrew, and no one uses it more or better than Isaiah. In fact, it is employed over 1,000 times in Isaiah. He uses parallelism a lot. All right, so let's try and define parallelism, and this is how I've defined it elsewhere. Parallelism is when words, phrases, or ideas are used in tandem with each other to add emphasis and to clarify meaning. All right, so that may not mean much to you now, but let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. All right, so we're going to look at Isaiah 59 as an example of poetic parallelism, where he says, "For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies, and your tongue hath muttered perverseness." So look, in this case, hands and fingers are in parallel with each other. That's two ways of saying basically the same thing. Your hands and your fingers, all right, and defiled with blood, and with iniquity are in parallel with each other. So this is two ways of saying the same thing. You are doing something. If we're going to throw symbolism in there, hands and fingers are symbolic of what you do. You are doing something that is bad. All right? And it's two different ways of saying that. Your lips and your tongue are in parallel with each other, and speaking lies and muttering perverseness are in parallel with each other. All right? So you see this parallelism and this parallelism combined, but you also get parallelism here. Hands and fingers and lips and tongues are in parallel with each other, so here's where it kind of defines and adds clarity. God is saying your problem is in what you do and in what you say. Right? Both can be a problem, meaning we have to be careful both of what we do and what we say. Right? And saying represents what we think in many ways, right? But and what we the iniquity of what we do is in parallel with the iniquity of what we say. And so again, you get this idea that together he's teaching us you have to watch, as King Benjamin would say, your thoughts, your words, and your deeds. All right, that's paraphrasing King Benjamin. That's what we learn when we recognize the parallelism. Now let's be clear, you don't have to be an expert on this. Even if you don't recognize it, it does its job naturally. The repetition and the comparisons and contrastings that happen with parallelism naturally help you recognize this. But when you're attuned to it and you start to look for it, it does it even more effectively, all right, more powerfully. And so that's what we want to do, is to just get you attuned to it enough. You don't have to recognize it every time it's used, but every now and then you'll recognize it and say, what should I learn from this? So let's look at a couple of specific examples. The most common kind of parallelism is what we call synonymous parallelism, where things are synonymous with each other. What we just looked at was synonymous parallelism. Here is some more synonymous parallelism that you're probably fairly familiar with. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib. You can see the two different parts that are in parallel with each other. But Israel doth not know, and my people doth not consider. You see, we've got four different pairs that are synonymous with each other, right? So that's seeing the synonymous parallelism in this. We'll come back to this because he's combining actually a couple different kinds of parallelism here. But note the synonymous parallelism. Let's look at another example, where in Isaiah 48 he says, "Oh, that thou hadst hearkened unto my commandment," and now we're going to see the synonymous parallelism. "Then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea. Thy seed also had been as the sand, and the offspring of thy bowels like the gravel thereof. His name should not have been cut off, nor destroyed from before me." All right, so you see the different colors represent what is synonymously parallel with each other. Peace and righteousness, river and waves, seed and offspring, sand and gravel, and so on, being cut off and being destroyed. But this gives us another example to see how, in parallel, not only does the repetition add emphasis and create further imagery, but it adds nuance. So look at this. If we just look at that first one, peace and righteousness are equated with each other. There's actually a sermon just in that. The fact that Isaiah says that there's something similar about peace and righteousness teaches us an important relationship between peace and righteousness. It's one that we can explore because we notice the parallelism, and it's one that gives nuance of meaning to this. I think that's beautiful and powerful, all right? And we'll start to recognize this as we recognize parallelism. So here's some antithetical parallelism. "If ye be willing and obedient, ye shall eat of the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured with the sword." So you see, willing and obedient is contrasted with refusing and rebelling, and the consequences are contrasted with each other, eating the good of the land, or you being eaten, right? So you see the contrast. So we've got comparing and contrasting. Comparing is the synonymous synonymous parallelism, and contrasting is the antithetical parallelism. And Isaiah's a master at combining these things. So remember, we've looked at this, where we have ox knowing and ass considering being synonymous parallelism, and Israel knowing, not knowing, and people not considering. But the pairs are contrasting with each other. So you see that we've got the dumb animals knowing is antithetically in parallel with God's people not knowing. right? They're contrasted with each other. That's pretty powerful stuff, all right? So let's look at the power of parallelism, all right? You're probably familiar with this verse from Isaiah chapter 1. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool, right? So we see antithetical parallelism here, where we've got sins that are scarlet becoming white like snow, and sins being scarlet is synonymous with red like crimson, and white as snow is synonymous with being as wool, but the sin is antithetical to white, and the red is antithetical to wool, right? So you can see how this works together. And so we get synonymous parallelism being also present, and that you can be forgiven. Now, this represents some of the power of parallelism. I think if Isaiah had just said, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow, and hadn't said repeated it with this poetic contrast and comparison, if he'd just done the first part, or if he'd just done the last part, I don't think we'd remember it nearly as well. But when you put these things together, the repetition and the emphasis on the contrast makes it so that you remember this. Most people remember this verse, maybe not word for word, but pretty close. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. That parallelistic emphasis creates an image in our mind and an impression in our heart that makes this powerful teaching stick with us. That's the power of parallelism. And it happened even when you didn't recognize it as parallelism. But it will happen more as you do recognize it as parallelism. We're going to look at one final form of parallelism that is the most complex, but it's probably also the most famous, and that's what we would call introverted parallelism, but it's better known as a chiasmus. Many people will know this. And this is when you start with a point and you work your way into a central point, and then you work your way back out, mirroring the way you worked in. So I'll give you an example. Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart. So you can see heart is parallel with heart, closer in, ears and ear and hearing, and we've got eyes next to eyes in the center of that, all right? Now, the great thing about a chiasmus is that you can recognize the most important element is the central element, and that the outermost elements kind of frame everything else. And even if you don't recognize this as a chiasmus, that happens somewhat naturally, but it happens more when you recognize it, all right? So now let's look at another example that we find in Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 3. And we'll just do this quickly, but you can see the parallelism here, all right? He says, "Arise and shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people. But the Lord shall arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. And the Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising." Right? It's a beautiful parallelism. It's a beautiful chiasmus, where we see that the central point is, and in this case it's E and F combined, the central point is that darkness needs to be dispelled, and that will happen as we arise with the light of God. That's beautiful stuff that, again, is taught naturally because of this chiasmus, but when you recognize it, it's taught even more powerfully. So let me just show you an example of a chiasmus that's huge, that spans chapters, that I noticed as I was preparing a commentary and looking at this. I figured out this chiasmus, and I think that's the first place it was published. It's giant. It goes from chapter 40 to chapter 57. And note the outside, the bracketing ideas are that God will comfort his people, but there's only one way for us to be comforted. And the central feature is that God will save his people through servants and covenants. All right, so that's important, and this, as you go through that section, this section of 40 through 57, I tell my students this, to look for these repeated themes that the world can't deliver, but God can and will deliver, but one must be keeping covenant with God to be delivered, and if you're not, he will humble you so that you will be. The covenant is available to all, and God will send his servants to help deliver people. All right, so those are the repeated themes in the chiasmus, but the overarching theme is that God and his servants will deliver those who keep covenant, and that we get that from the brackets, the first and the last chapters, and from those central chapters, chapter 48 and 49, which is about being saved, covenant holders being redeemed, which, by the way, are the chapters that Nephi focuses on the most. Chapter 48 and 49, those are his central Isaiah chapters. He caught on to this covenant and used it, this chiasmus. Nephi caught on to this chiasmus and used it to teach us. And he emphasizes those central themes of redemption and the fact that that servants will be sent to bring redemption to us. It's beautiful stuff, all right? So the overarching theme is highlighted at the beginning and the end, but really you can find it throughout. And the idea is that everyone is welcome to make the covenant, but deliverance only comes to those who both make and keep the covenant. So look for that not only in this section, but you'll actually find that that's a major theme of Isaiah in general. All right, that's something we can find as we recognize the chiasmus. Some of them you'll recognize on your own, and some of them you'll have help from different commentaries as you look at that. There are some commentaries that are excellent at this. All right, let's go to another key in understanding Isaiah's writing and some of the poetic elements of this, and that is looking for sections and continuity. And by this I mean that often there are chapters that break up a continuous thought. The chapter, they were divided into chapters not by Isaiah, but later for convenience sake, and often those chapter breaks are right in the middle of a thought. I can't tell you as I was writing my commentary how many times I had to start the commentary of verse 1 of whatever chapter. I think more times than not, I think most of the time, I had to start talking about verse 1 by saying, this is a continuation of the same thought that was in the last verse of the last chapter. But we often miss this because our mind makes a break between those chapters, and often we read a chapter a day or something like that and we stop. So whenever you start again, go look at the last verses of the chapter before it so that you can do that. What's more, there are chapters that go together. I just show you how we had chapter 40 through 57 going together in a chiasmus, but there are lots of sections that should go together. You can, if you start doing some outlining of what Isaiah means, you'll come up with this on your own. You can also look at commentaries that might help you with this. I'm going to give you just some big chunks of sections that go together, all right? So if we're going to look at the structure of Isaiah, and this is just the way I put it together, these are the chunks that I see. Chapter 1 is a preface. It's like section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Chronologically, it's not the first thing Isaiah writes, but it's a good way of conveying the theme for the whole book. So at some point, it's put in as the beginning. We get chapter 2 through 5, which represent what the Book of Mormon would call the pride cycle. I would really call it the covenant or covenant corruption cycle, meaning that God blesses us because we keep the covenant, we get all these blessings, then we start to think that all these great things that are happening are because we're wonderful, and we stop keeping the covenant. So then God will humble us to remind us to keep the covenant. We start to keep the covenant, and then we get blessings again. And that's a cycle that we see people go through. We call it the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon, the idolatry cycle in the Old Testament. We call it all sorts of things elsewhere. It always revolves around that covenant. But I don't want to really call it, I'd call it covenant corruption cycle, because if we were really keeping the covenant, then we'd have a good covenant cycle that just spirals upwards rather than this kind of downward repetitive cycle. So 2 through 5 is about that. Chapter 6 is about Isaiah's call, and it's a counterpoint. He humbles himself rather than being forced to be humble. Chapter 7 through 12, we get more about the pride and covenant cycle. 13 through 23, he addresses the nations. This is, they're from different, they were written at different points in time. They're not addressed or arranged chronologically, but kind of thematically. He has addresses to all sorts of nations, so they're all thrown in that section of chapters. All right. 24 through 27 is victory for the righteous. Those who turn to God will receive victory. 28 through 30 is warning for those who don't listen. If you won't listen to God, you won't be victorious, but you will suffer. 31 through 39 is about the impending destruction and salvation of Judah. We're going to talk about that in a minute when we get into the history section. 40 through 57 is this chiasmus about servants and covenant and redemption. And then we get chapter 58 is a change of heart. It represents them changing their heart. And 59 is kind of about that as well. But 59 through 66 of the rest are about the redemption and the exaltation of Israel because they've had this change of heart. All right? So those are just big chunks or sections of Isaiah that I think will be helpful for you to recognize as you go through and read Isaiah. So let's combine some of the things we've learned and look at something, all right? We're going to combine some poetry and symbolism, and we're going to look for sections and how they flow together and not let them get broken up and see what we can draw from this. So we're going to look at some verses that are fairly famous. People are fairly familiar with this. This is when God uses the daughters of Zion to represent all of Judah and especially all of Jerusalem. And he's going to do so because they're the best that Judah has to offer. And he's going to show that they are not doing well, which means that Judah is not doing well. All right? So he says, "Moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet." So I want you to think of this. What's going on with the daughters of Zion? Well, they're prideful, and they want people to notice them. In particular, they want men to notice them. All right? They want men to notice them and be attracted to them. They want to have scads of men who are following after them and are attracted to them because they are haughty. And the way they're doing it is doing it the way the world has said they should do it, with just walking and mincing and their eyes and so on. They're wanting the things the world tells them to want, and they're trying to get them in the way the world tells them to get them. Therefore, the Lord will smite with the scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. In that day, so that day is when he brings judgment, the Lord will take away the bravery of their, and now we're going to get this list of things that they have. Their tinkling ornaments about their feet, and their calls, and their round tires like the moon, and the chains, and the bracelets, and the mufflers, the bonnets, and the ornaments of the legs, and the headbands, and the tablets, and the earrings, and the rings, and the nose jewels, and the changeable suits of apparel, and the mantles, and the wimples, and the crisping pins, and the glasses, and the fine linen, and the hoods, and the veils, all of those things, all right? So I don't know that there's anything intrinsically wrong with any of those. The problem is that's what they've been relying on. Rather than trying to get the things of God and doing it in God's way, they're trying to get the things of the world, and they're doing it in the world's way. And this is the world's way, to have all this stuff. And so they're going about the wrong thing, or trying to get the wrong thing in the wrong way, all because the world has influenced them. And what will be the result? Well, it shall come to pass that instead of a sweet smell, there will be stink, right? This is a reversal of what's supposed to happen. We'll talk more about that in the fourth lecture, but it's a reversal of what's supposed to happen. Instead of a girdle, a rent. Instead of well-set hair, baldness. And instead of a stomacher, a girding of sackcloth, and a burning instead of beauty. All right, so all of the things that they wanted that would make them look good, they get the opposite. And they're not going to look good. This is God humbling them so that they will want to return to him, right? So what we've had is this synecdoche, the daughters of Zion, representing all of Judah. We've had the symbolism of their trying to attract men by all these accoutrements, right? That's symbolic of us trying to get the things of the world in the world's way. And then we get the symbolism of God turning all of that on their head. So I don't know if he really cares whether they smell good from perfume or they stink from whatever else. He's trying to say that's symbolic of whatever it is you're trying to want, you're going to get the opposite of that. All right, and as I said, we'll talk about that in lecture 4. That's part of the covenant. When you don't keep the covenant, you get the reversal of the blessings. All right, so that's what's happening. But now let's look at verse 25. All right, remember that they are trying to attract men by the way they look. And it's not going to work because they're going to stop looking that way. But what's more, thy men shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in the war. They're not going to get men because they don't look the way they want, but also because the men are going to die in war. And Isaiah's talking about something that really happens. In the northern kingdom, there are huge battles. Lots of men die in war. In the southern kingdom, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, comes in, wipes out the kingdom. Just hundreds and thousands of men die in battle, literally. This is a thing that really happens. They die in battle so that these women can't get men because the men have died. And instead, they will sit in the gates and lament because of the terrible things that have happened. All right? That's teaching us when you go after the wrong things and the world's things in the way the world wants you to, then it's not going to work. Instead, you get humbled and you get none of it. But the question is, does it stop there? We usually stop that line of thought there, but no, it keeps going. So I've got it set up here so you can see there's a chapter break and a chapter heading, and that distracts us, but the thought actually continues. What's the next verse? And in that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. When we get rid of the chapter break, when we put these sections together the way we should, we see that it's just a continuation of that same thought. The reason that these women who wanted to have lots of men following them, and at one point they may have been successful in that. All of these women, because the way they dressed and walked and did their things, got lots of men following them, but because they followed the world instead of God, so they didn't keep the covenant, now they're in the opposite situation. Because all the men are dead, now you're going to have a 7-to-1 women to men ratio. And 7 women are going to be going after the same guy as opposed to 7 guys going after the same woman, right? This is the situation that has arisen because they are not keeping the covenant because they've been seduced by the world. That's what Isaiah is teaching us, and keeping verse 1 with the thought process that was going on in the chapter before that helps us feel that all the more. It creates an image that evokes a feeling in us that should make us want to keep the covenant. All right, so that's going back to things we discussed in lecture 1, where we want to look at this imagery and what Isaiah is trying to evoke in us and have happen as a result of that. So that's some good example, I think, of using symbols and poetic devices and keeping sections of text together so that we can get some meaning out of Isaiah. Let's look at some other literary devices that Isaiah uses that we can, if we just get these things in our mind, we can understand a number of passages in Isaiah. Isaiah often sets things up as if it were a court case, as if it were God indicting Judah or Israel. All right? He often does that. So here's an example. Hear, O heavens, so see, he's calling for witnesses. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. Now here's the indictment. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Then we get these verses we've already looked at. The ox knows his owner, and the ass his master's crib, but these people are sinful, and they're going away, and they've provoked me to anger. All right, so but you get all of this is set as an indictment. He is very clearly showing to Israel what they have done wrong, and then he will show them what happens as a result. But the first stage is the indictment to show them what they have done wrong. All right, and it's set up as a court case. And when we recognize that, we can understand it just a little bit better. Here's another example from Isaiah chapter 3. The Lord standeth up to plead, and standeth to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof. For ye have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. What mean ye that ye beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, saith the Lord God of hosts? You see what he's doing. He is saying, I'm going to enter into judgment for you. Here's the indictment. You haven't been taking care of people the way you should have, and in fact, you're using the things that you should use to take care of people to aggrandize yourself. And so you are becoming wealthy by punishing them rather than helping them. That's the indictment. All right? And as we see that he's doing this indictment, it just makes a little more sense to us. All right? Now, following indictments, we often get judgments, where he comes out and he says, now, maybe we shouldn't say judgment. Maybe a better phrase would be the punishment, the terms that they're given, right? This is often stated in what we call a woe oracle, where he says, woe unto you, because now this is what's happening. You've been pronounced guilty. So that's the verdict. Now here's the punishment. The sentencing. That's the phrase I'm trying to think of. He is going to sentence them, all right? So, woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hand shall be given unto him. This is what they're being sentenced with, all right? Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy. So, now we're getting the indictment after the woe, all right? To turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, and the widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. So it's that same kind of indictment. You're not taking care of the poor, and in fact, the things that you've been given to take care of the poor, you're keeping for yourselves. And what will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from afar? To whom will ye flee for help, and where will ye leave your glory? You're not going to escape the long arm of the law, is what he's saying. Without me they shall bow down under the prisoners. This is the sentencing. They'll be prisoners. they shall fall under the slain. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. And then he's going to talk about how the Assyrians will come in and destroy them. That's their sentencing. Because of what they've done, they are going to be destroyed. All right, so that's just an interesting literary device where we see these kind of legal terminology used. And as we recognize it, then we can better understand what God is saying people have done wrong and what the consequences are. All right, now let's turn to this idea of understanding history can help us understand Isaiah better. I cannot emphasize how important this is. Isaiah lived in a specific historical context, and he spoke about and to that context. If we understand what's going on in his day, we can better understand what he's saying, and then we can apply it to our day. We're going to focus on that in other lectures when we talk about understanding the original context and then how that helps us apply it to our day. But first of all, we have to understand the history. And in the end, there's not very much history. It's not that complicated, and there's not that much that you need to know to understand Isaiah. And you'll start to say, oh, I see he's talking about this or this or this. Really only kind of three things that he's going to talk about. A couple of different historical events that he's going to talk about. And once you know those events, you can start to understand what he's talking about. So let's look at some interesting facts about Isaiah. Some of this we did in Lecture 1. Let's review it a little bit and then jump into what's happening in his day. So he's born around 770, 760, something like that, BC. Receives his call around 740. I think he's probably born in closer to 760, and then he receives his call around 760 or 740. Traditionally, he dies around 690, somewhere in there. All right. He serves under several kings of Judah, as we've talked about in Lecture 1, and this little graphic that I've made is designed to help us see that he prophesies during these kings of Assyria, and this is important. He prophesies during the last kings of Israel. It is during his ministry that the kings of Israel, or that Israel is scattered and destroyed. We'll talk more about that. He prophesies for several kings of Judah, during the reigns of several kings of Judah. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on in Isaiah's day? Historically, what is happening? Well, let's ask, first of all, big picture, what's happening in the region? And what's happening is the Assyrian Empire is growing. You can see here that they start out in this kind of orange area, and then they expand, eventually taking over even Egypt, but they expand right through where the country of Israel is. And so these are the events that Isaiah is addressing in his prophesying. These are the things that he and the people around him have to deal with, that Assyria is coming. And he's going to warn them again and again and again, if you don't repent, you will be destroyed by Assyria. All right, that's his warning. All right, so let's ask specifically what's happening in Israel and in Judah. All right, now, this is an important historical element that will help us understand a number of prophecies, especially chapters 7 through 9, but a number of prophecies, all right? So I have highlighted Isaiah chapter 7 here, but this is just an event that we need to understand all of Isaiah. As the Assyrians are coming to take over these areas, the people there don't want to be taken over, big surprise, but they know that Assyria is big and powerful. So Israel and Syria, and we have to be careful to distinguish between Syria and Assyria. Unfortunately, in English, those words are very similar to each other, just to make our lives difficult. But Israel and Syria, just to the north of Israel, decide that they're not strong enough on their own, but maybe if they ally with each other, they will be able to withstand the Assyrian Empire. And then once they've formed that alliance, they think we're probably still not strong enough. Let's get Judah to join us. All right, so that's going to become an important element here. And Judah isn't so sure that even all three of them together can withstand Assyria, so they don't really want to join the alliance. That makes Syria and Israel decide that they would like to go to war against Judah and force them to be part of this alliance. And if that doesn't work, they're also thinking of assassinating the king, Ahaz, and putting someone on the throne that would make an alliance with them. So that comes to play in a lot of prophecies in Isaiah, all right? So we're going to have Judah referred to by its king, King Ahaz. It's referred to by Jerusalem and also the house of David. So these are just different ways of referring to it. Syria is referred to by their king, King Rezin, also called Aram or Damascus. That's the capital. And Israel is referred to as Pekah, son of Remaliah, or Ephraim, or Samaria, which is their capital, all right? And you've got the idea that they want to withstand Assyria, and so Israel and Syria are going to come to battle against Judah. Now, that will help us, and it sets some major themes in the book of Isaiah, because King Ahaz is going to be given a difficult choice. He knows that there's some outside forces that are really squeezing him, and he has to choose. Should he trust in the power of an alliance, or should he trust in the power of Assyria? Right? And these are the only choices he can see. He says, okay, I can either say, I'll join this alliance and will resist Assyria. If I don't join the alliance, then those two kingdoms are going to come against me, and I can't withstand them. So then I'm going to have to ask Assyria to help me, in which case I come under the power of Assyria. So they don't seem like good choices. Does he have other options? Right? That's the question. What other options does he have? And he does not see any other options. But Isaiah will give him an option. Isaiah will say, don't do either of those. Do nothing but trust in God and let God take care of it. This is one of the major themes of Isaiah. Will you trust in God even when it doesn't make sense? Even when the way the world is looking at things and the only things you can see all have problems with them, and what God tells you makes no sense according to the way the world looks at things and the way the world would tell you to do things. Will you trust in God? Isaiah gives him that option. Do nothing, trust in God. Ahaz ignores Isaiah. That's unfortunate, and as a result, Judah will come under the control of Assyria. It didn't have to happen. They experience a lot of pain and a lot of suffering because of that. It didn't have to happen, but that's what happens because he didn't choose the without God impossible option, although all things are possible with God, but it seemed impossible. He didn't choose that option because he didn't trust in God. He trusted in the ways of the world, and he paid a price for it, and all of us people paid a price for it. All right, that's important to understand. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. But in the meantime, let's look at the other thing that Isaiah is dealing with. He is pleading with the kingdom of Israel to repent so that they are not destroyed, and they ignore him. So historically what happens? In about 730 BC, we get King Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria coming in and conquering Israel and bringing a lot of Israelites captive back into Assyria. But Israel will rebel again after not too long. About 10 years later, the Assyrians come back, and this time, because it's the second time they've been rebelling and they really make them pay a price, they bring a number of people back. They bring a huge segment of the population, maybe even the majority of the population, back to Assyria, and then from there, those people scatter throughout the entire earth. And this is of major concern to Isaiah. He will be addressing the destruction and scattering of Israel constantly, and he also will be holding out the hope for that. He knows that in his day, even though he will warn them, and he does warn them, he's like Mormon and Moroni, they're warning the people knowing they're not going to listen, knowing they're going to be destroyed. And so he keeps warning and keeps warning, but he knows they're going to be scattered and destroyed, but he keeps holding out hope. Don't worry, even though you'll be scattered, God will gather you again. It's not the end of the story when you're scattered. God will gather you. That becomes a major theme in Isaiah, the scattering and gathering of Israel. Warning, then scattering, and then gathering. That's important stuff. There's another really important element in this, and that is what happens with King Hezekiah. Hezekiah is the son of Ahaz. And as I said, because of Ahaz's choice, Assyria dominates Judah and exacts a huge toll. They exact a great amount of wealth in terms of agriculture, silver, all sorts of things. Every year they have to pay a huge tribute. It's a huge tax burden on the people, like more than a 50% tax kind of a thing. We think, we don't know exactly, but it's just hard for them to survive and get by because of this. But what's more, they have to send tribute of youth to serve in the army, to serve as slaves and servants in all sorts of different ways. Young men in the army and as servants, young women as all sorts of different servants you don't want your daughters to be. This becomes a burden that is too much for them to bear, to keep sending their children off. And so eventually Hezekiah will rebel against Assyria. And as he does so, he is going to be given the same choice that his father had. What will he trust in this rebellion? Now let's look and see if we can understand some of the historical things that are going on in Hezekiah's day, all right? And we can do this to some degree by looking at the growth that happens to Jerusalem while Hezekiah is king. And I'm using this model of the city that is at the Jerusalem Center, BYU's Jerusalem Center on Mount Scopus. This is a model of the city in Hezekiah's day, all right? So in about 740 BC, so this is before Hezekiah, the population of Jerusalem, which is just right here, is about 8,000 people, and it's at 32 acres. So from the time of David in, say, 1000 BC to 740 BC, we get all the way up to 8,000 people, 32 acres. It's not very big. This is where the city is at that point, plus the temple that's there just to the north of it, all right? In about 705 BC, so this is after the northern kingdom has been destroyed, all right? In 705 BC, the population has mushroomed to about 30,000 BC, and it's taking up about 130 acres. This is when they expand from just Mount Moriah over across the Tyropoeon Valley and up into Mount Zion. And Isaiah will have to build a wall to protect these people. But you can see this population has skyrocketed, and we believe that this is largely refugees from the north. As the Assyrians were pillaging the countryside, tons of people come from the north down to the south, many of them to Jerusalem. They're refugees from what's going on, the war and the destruction in the north. This is actually our most likely time for Lehi's family to come down. Lehi is from the tribe of Manasseh. That's a northern kingdom tribe. There are different migrations of people from the north, so they could have come at another time, but this is when the most people came. So it's the most likely time that Lehi's family comes to Jerusalem. All right. Now we're going to jump to 700 BC. Hezekiah is going to rebel, as we said, against Assyria, and Assyria will come and destroy Judah and destroy everything but Jerusalem. So we're coming back to that in just a minute. That's a key element in what Isaiah is prophesying about. But let's look at what happens in Jerusalem at that time. The population goes up another 10,000, and it gets even larger. The growth is even larger. And I'm putting these circles, and we don't know if that's exactly where the people settled, but it's around there, all right? And what is that? That seems to be the refugees from Judah. As the Assyrian army goes through the countryside, lots of people flee and come to Jerusalem. All right, so now we can see this area, and you can see along here is where the original city of David or Jerusalem was, but it grows up onto this hill here, all right? So there's a lot of important growth that happens there. This is a wall that goes through there on Mount Zion that Hezekiah built to try to protect the people that were building on Mount Zion and that were outside of the walls that had already been built. This wall is much larger than what you can see. It was much taller, and it's very broad. As you see, it's called the Broad Wall. Now let's read something from Isaiah about this wall, actually. He says, "You've seen also the breaches of the city of David, that they are many. And you gathered together the waters of the lower pool." We'll talk about that. "And you've numbered the houses of Jerusalem, and the houses you have broken down to fortify the wall. You also made a ditch between the two walls." So, all right, we're going to talk about those things, and we're going to come back to this verse. Note verse 10, "You've numbered the houses of Jerusalem, and the houses you've broken down to fortify the wall." Well, look at this wall that we have here, and you can see it's actually built right here, the remains of a house. They went, for whatever reason, and we don't know why, they destroyed this house to build a wall. It went right through the house. Isaiah wasn't very pleased with that for a number of reasons, but that's interesting to see actual touchstone evidence of what Isaiah was talking about. Now, Hezekiah has the same choice as his father. Will he trust in the way the world tells him to protect his people, or the way God does? And Isaiah is accusing him of not looking to God. He's accusing him of a couple of things. In other chapters, say chapter 40 through 42 and so on, he accuses them of turning to Egypt, just like his father Ahaz turned to Assyria. Now, as they're trying to escape Assyria, Hezekiah is sending messengers to Egypt and asking Egypt to help them. He's also doing all sorts of stuff to fortify Jerusalem himself, right? let's look at an example of that, and then we're going to come back to this. He builds, as we said, he gathers the water and builds a ditch, right? They've got a water source, but if they're going to be besieged by this huge army, they want to take that water source, which is funneling outside the city, and so that all sorts of people can come get water, and they're going to bring it so that the water comes inside the city. So it seems like this started during his father's day, maybe because Israel and Syria were coming to besiege him, but it's Hezekiah who seems to finish it, and so we get him building this huge tunnel that will take water from the Gihon spring and bring it down to a pool they create, the Pool of Siloam. It goes underneath the city so that they can keep the water inside the city. I'm going to show you this on a little video when I ran through that tunnel with the GoPro. We won't watch the whole thing, but we'll show you a little bit of this. Okay, so here's the video as we step in. This is coming right into the Gihon spring, and there's the spring where it comes out. And this is the tunnel that Isaiah, it's actually his workmen, of course, carved out. And we won't watch very much more of this, but you can see this tunnel that they carved. It goes a long ways, and it's really quite an impressive work feat where they started on one side, they started on two sides, and they worked towards each other and eventually met in the middle where then the water started going through. So that's pretty impressive work that Isaiah does to make it so that they can be okay during a siege, so that they can have some water, right? That's pretty impressive work. But the problem is that they're not looking to God, as we see in verse 11 of chapter 22. But ye have not looked unto the maker thereof, neither had respect unto him that fashioned it long ago. So Hezekiah starts out doing what his father had done. He's trusting in Egypt and trusting in the works that he did to protect them, building a wall, building a tunnel, and so on. Now, they're going to be miraculously spared, right? And we get this, the results of this in 1 Nephi chapter 2, when Laman and Lemuel won't believe that Jerusalem, that great city, could be destroyed according to the word of the prophets. And they were like unto the Jews who were at Jerusalem, who sought to take away the life of my father. The reason they didn't think it could be destroyed is because God did miraculously spare Jerusalem. Well, why? It wasn't because of the tunnel, and it wasn't because of going to Egypt. Here's the warning against Egypt that we have in chapter 30. Woe to the rebellious children, saith the Lord, that take counsel, but not of me, and that cover with a covering, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, that walk to go down to Egypt, and have not asked at my mouth to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, and the trust in the shadow of Egypt your confusion. You see what he's saying? You went down and asked Egypt. You never even asked me if you should do that. You're trusting in the world instead of asking me what will work. You're building walls and tunnels instead of asking me. Is going to Egypt a problem? Probably not. Are building walls and tunnels a problem? No, probably a good idea. But when you don't involve God in the decision, then all you're doing is relying on yourself and the world's ideas instead of on God. All right. Fortunately, Hezekiah responds well. When Isaiah challenges him with these things and chastises him with these things, Isaiah responds. And as a result, that when Assyria comes, Judah is saved. The army comes to besiege them, and then an Egyptian army comes. They're surviving the siege because they have a wall and they have water. It's not a long siege because an Egyptian army comes and the Assyrian army leaves Jerusalem to go meet the Egyptian army, and then God smites the Assyrian army and they're destroyed and Jerusalem is miraculously spared. Why? Because Hezekiah had gotten them to get rid of their idols, to repent and renew their covenant and trust in God. He responded to the prophet and trusted in God and got his people to trust in God. And then these other things of the world worked. Sometimes it will be that way. Sometimes it won't be the things of the world that work. Everything works better when we turn to God and trust in God, not our own wisdom and judgment and the ways the world tells us to do things. That's why Jerusalem is spared. And this becomes one of the great images that we see throughout Isaiah. Isaiah referring to the destruction that happened in Israel and the destruction that happened in Judah, and how only Jerusalem was left in Judah. So when you get in chapter 1, when he talks about a cottage in a vineyard or a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, he's describing how the whole countryside has been destroyed and only one thing is left, and that one thing is Jerusalem. He's going to use that. He's going to talk about that a lot, talking about the destruction and all that is left is Jerusalem. But thank goodness Jerusalem was spared, because they did eventually turn to God under Hezekiah. It's wonderful. And then we start to see Isaiah start holding out images of hope. He knows that there's destruction coming, and then destruction has come, but throughout he holds out images of hope. So for example, we get this in chapter 10, verse 22. For though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant of them shall return. So everyone else is going to be destroyed, but a remnant shall return. The consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness. So they'll be consumed, but there's a little bit that is then going to overflow with righteousness. Or in chapter 33, the earth mourneth and languisheth. Lebanon is ashamed and hewn down. Sharon is like a wilderness, and Bashan and Carmel shake off their fruits. So this is images of the terrible things that happen because they're not keeping their covenant. Now will I rise, saith the Lord. Now will I be exalted. Now will I lift up myself. And then we see a few verses later, the sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness hath surprised the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? They're asking, how are we going to survive this? He that walketh righteously and speaketh uprightly, he that despiseth the gain of oppressions, that shaketh his hands from holding of bribes, that stoppeth his ears from hearing of blood, and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil, he shall dwell on high. His place of defense shall be the munitions of rocks. Bread shall be given him. His waters shall be sure. You see what Isaiah does is in the midst of all of the terrible things that are happening in his day, he knows that those who will keep covenant will eventually triumph. Yes, destruction and sorrow are going to come, but God will always preserve a remnant of his covenant people and a remnant of you as his covenant person, as you have the natural man torn away from you, either voluntarily you kill off the natural man in you, or God humbles you and kills off the natural man in you. A remnant of you will be preserved, and a remnant of Israel as a whole will be preserved. God will gather those remnants to him and make of them something beautiful that will experience peace and joy. It's my testimony of that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.